Thank you so much, Mr. Dimba, for the introductions of our speakers for today's webinar. We are now going to hand over to Advocate Pensi Tlakula, the chairperson of the Information Regulator, to actually provide the opening statement for this webinar. Chairperson, over to you, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Advocate Wepond. I hope you can all see me and hear me. Can I get that confirmation from you, Advocate Wepond?
Yes, Chair, you are audible and we can see you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I also want to join my colleagues in welcoming everyone who has joined this important webinar, which happens on the morning when we woke up to the news of the video and the images, photos of an American singer called Taylor Smith, which was altered by AI to portray her in sexually explicit images. We know that X has blocked searches of her name from being accessible to the public, but that's just too little too late. And that is what we are dealing with here today, that digital platforms can deal with misinformation and disinformation, but it is normally after the fact. So I'm hoping that in our discussions today, or even in the lead up to elections, we will find ways of encouraging or ensuring that digital platforms deal with misinformation and disinformation, including fake news, before they hit the platforms. We have a good representation today. And as it has already been said, today it's International Data Privacy Day. And we have been joined here by a number of stakeholders, including organized professional bodies, media houses, social media platforms, and I'm hoping we'll hear from them later on this topic, civil society organizations, political parties, and the private sector. And as we are all aware, the Information Regulator is the custodian of information rights in South Africa. And we have a dual mandate, which is the protection of personal information and the promotion of access to information. So this dual mandate and that we have means that we have to always ensure that the right of access to information is balanced against the right to privacy as it relates to the protection of personal information. And this at times is not an easy balance to do. So what is the problem of misinformation and disinformation and the interference with the protection of personal information during the elections? With the forthcoming general elections, and maybe the CEO of the IEC will take us into his confidence and tell us the election date. But with the elections coming, the regulator has two primary concerns, which are the handling of personal information of voters by political parties and other role players in the electoral process. We know that once campaigning heightens, we'll begin to be bombarded with messages on our cell phones and on our emails from political parties and independent candidates at this point who will try to convince us to vote for them. And that is something that is regulated or that comes within the purview of, or falls within the purview of POPIA. And Advocate Wikanyo will tell us more about this and what the regulator is doing in that regard. But we're also concerned about the phenomenon of misinformation and disinformation because this impedes the free flow of credible, reliable, and accurate information which is necessary for the electorate to make their choices during the elections. With the concern on the processing of personal information of voters by political parties for campaigning purposes, in 2019, the regulator issued a guidance note on the processing of personal information of a voter by a political party in terms of POPIA. Advocate Buikanyo will talk about this more, as I've already indicated, but I think I also have to announce that because that guidance note was adopted in 2019, I think the Information Regulator intends to amend it in the run up to the 2024 elections and to bring it up to date with the latest developments in technology. Ahead of this engagement, I had the opportunity to discuss the challenges of processing of personal information of voters by political parties for campaigning purposes and the threat of misinformation and disinformation during elections with political parties at the IEC National Party Liaison Committee. And I must say that I was quite pleased to say that the political parties have the same heightened concern regarding disinformation and misinformation and its impact on the forthcoming election. The session ended with a progressive recommendation which may contribute to being a solution not only for misinformation and disinformation, but also for data protection. And one of those recommendations was that there is a need to implement a robust community education program to create awareness among the community on the dangers of misinformation and disinformation. And further, there was another recommendation that there is a need to convene a multi-stakeholder engagement with key role players such as the media, social media platforms, and other regulatory bodies in order to continuously and collaborate on this effort of dispelling the distribution of incorrect and harmful information. So we will be convening this multi-stakeholder engagement, and we will be inviting you to participate in that. Robin Porteous, a South African researcher and writer, wrote an opinion piece published by the Daily Maverick early last year entitled, and I quote, "Fake News, the Fight for South Africa's Future in the Face of Mounting Disinformation," close quote. Please note the words mounting, which is a clear indication that this pandemic of misinformation and disinformation keeps on growing, and it may lead to it being an unattainable monster. In this piece, Porteous says that, and I quote, "From news stories that have doctored just right to masterful blend truth and fiction in an attempt to inspire outrage and mistrust, to hate mongering and harassment, inciting trolls, sock puppets and bots, digital misinformation campaigns have the very power to undermine the legitimacy of upcoming elections and erode public trust in our nation's democratic institutions," close quote. I couldn't agree more, because in most instances, when information is doctored, there is use of various personal information of a data subject where the image of a person or their speech, which is personal information, is altered to perpetuate incorrect and false news so as to incite chaos, not to mention the hindrance of free flow of credible, reliable, and accurate information. Misinformation and disinformation are a global problem, and it has a great impact on elections and democracy throughout the world. And according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, and I quote, the ease with which users can create content that does not need to be verified or approved before being launched globally, combined with the speed at which this information can be shared, has connected communities and empowered citizen journalists. These technological advancements have also, however, increased the risks related to the creation and distribution of misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, and hoaxes. In the context of processing personal information during the elections, this means that political parties and independent candidates as responsible parties must comply with the provisions of POPIA, specifically the 8 conditions for the lawful processing of personal information. This is more so when political parties and independent candidates include in their campaign tools such as robocalls, emails, campaigns, email campaigns, SMS campaigns, and social media messaging. As the institutional home of the right of access to information, the regulator prioritizes the free flow of information, which is an essential component of a democratic system. For members of the public to exercise agency as voters in a democratic system, they need full, accurate, and reliable information about the electoral process and options available to them when they cast their votes. One of the stated objectives of the African Union's African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, which was adopted by the AU Assembly in 2007, is to, and I quote, promote the establishment of the necessary conditions to foster citizens' participation, transparency, access to information, freedom of the press, and accountability in the management of public affairs, close quote. Therefore, access to information lies at the core of the exercise of the right to vote. We have also seen this phenomenon at home. Recently, a leader of a political party wrote to the IEC to report that someone claiming to be from the IEC was offering to rig 200,000 votes on behalf of the party. And I mean, the IEC has been recently a victim of misinformation and disinformation on social media platforms. So what can be done? The launch of the Real 1-1 platform is a great initiative to counter misinformation and disinformation that relates to the elections. Also welcome is the initiative to partner with social media companies to counter the proliferation of misinformation and disinformation. The IEC and other electoral role players may also consider supporting political campaigns in their efforts to develop a cybersecurity capacities and track disinformation. And I'm hoping that the IEC might also consider developing a code of conduct for digital platforms because their legislation allows them to adopt codes of conduct. With this being said, we look forward to more deliberation on this topic and introduction of partnership to drive solutions. Thank you to the IEC, the Media Monitoring South Africa, the Center for Human Rights of the Pretoria University, for also partnering with us to drive this conversation further. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you to the chairperson of the Information Regulator for the opening statement. And I must say that we are also witnessing an unprecedented number of elections that will be taking place for the 2024 calendar year. That being said, I'd also like to thank the chairperson of the Information Regulator for introducing some concrete aspects that provides a great threat to the processing of personal information during the election period. That being said, I'd like to introduce Mr. Sai Mamabolo, who is the CEO of the IEC, to address us on the topic of combating mis and disinformation during the election period. Thank you so much, and over to you, Mr. Sai Mamabolo.
Thank you very much, Advocate Webpoint, and greetings to everybody on the platform. I'm going to my slides are not moving. I'm just sorting out my presentation. It appears not to be moving. So just one sec through you, Chair.
It's in order, Mr. Mamabolo.
Is it moving on your side?
Not yet.
Okay. Let me stop sharing and maybe relaunch it. Thank you very much, and sorry about the glitch. I think let's start at this point that the term of office and provincial legislature subsists for 5 years, and in the present case, that 5 years concludes in May. So the elections are scheduled to be held within 90 days of the expiry of that term. Meaning an election can happen from the middle of May to the middle of August. The Commission has just concluded or is about to conclude consultations with the President, and we hope that he will take the country into confidence insofar as the election date is concerned. We had the first registration weekend in November last year, and we scheduled to have another one this weekend. Of course, these are intended to give the greatest opportunity for South Africans to enlist on the voters' roll and thus be in a position to participate when eventually the election is called. I could just add that following the registration of South African citizens abroad over this past weekend, the voters' roll for the first time stands at just over 27 million. So even before the second registration weekend, we've breached the psychological milestone of 27 million. In the 2019 election, we had 26.7 million people on the voters' roll. And we suffered major losses during the COVID pandemic, but we've been able now to reverse the losses made during that point. We will be on Wednesday and Thursday this week be visiting all correctional centers to again afford South Africans who are serving prison terms an opportunity to register. And I don't want to go into detail relating to the participation of independent candidates. Safe to say, as a novel experience, independent candidates are going to be participating in these elections. they'll participate in the national election by contesting the regional seats, region to national seats. That component of the election of the National Assembly will be contested by both independent candidates as well as party candidates. And then the provincial legislatures will also be contested by both party candidates as well as independent candidates. Now, to define social media as we understand it and as we work with it, it really is the digital communication platform that allow users to create, share, and interact with content in real time. It encompasses various online platforms and applications where individuals, corporates, organizations can connect, communicate, and engage through image, through text, and video, and other multimedia formats. And social media platforms provide tools for users to create profiles, post content, interact with others by liking, commenting, sharing, and messaging. Needless to say, examples in this regard include LinkedIn, TikTok, Telegram, Spotify, YouTube, and so on. Eric Kuhlman says the power of social media is it forces necessary change. In other words, for institutional sustainability, organizations must, of necessity, change to accommodate the reality of social media. And there's a lot of positive aspects to the reality of social media, as is negative dimensions. But an institution that does not change in order to accommodate the reality of social media will probably have sustainability challenges. Just to give you some examples, over 4.8 billion people across the world use social media. And there's been 150 million new global users between April 2022. So in just 12 months, there's been 150 million new global users of social media, which means it is a fast-growing medium of communication. It's growing at a very significant speed in comparison with traditional media. In South Africa, 25.8 million of the 43 million internet users are actually active social media consumers. 51% of those who use social media are female, and 48% are male. And the age demographic is relatively young, with 30%, just under 30% in the age category 25 to 34 and 18 to 24, representing 27%. I won't deal with the platforms. I think platforms that are well known to all of us. Now, in respect of the IEC's usage of social media, there are 5 or 4 key components to our use of social media. Firstly, is to engage citizens, voters, and stakeholders, in a sense, to provide a customer service to to the electorate. In other words, you can harness the social media such that it provides a service to people, articulating things such as when the voter registration weekend is, what is required for purposes of registration, where do you register, am I registered? All that detail is being provided to citizens through social media. And this is important because young persons in particular use social media for purposes of political engagement. They do not engage in politics. And in fact, in any other sphere of public endeavor, they don't do it in a community hall, such as was the case in the 70s, 80s, and so on. Young people engage politically and otherwise on social media. So they consume information and political discourse on social media platforms. So it's important, therefore, that you harness that and use that as a channel of providing electoral information. Secondly, brand management, especially managing the mis and disinformation component, which I'll come to in a short while. But as much as you provide electoral information, you also need to provide educational material on social media, which is what we are also doing. And to provide an avenue for to encourage citizen participation in the electoral process. Ultimately, all these initiatives are geared towards growing participation in the elections and ultimately greater voter turnout. Just to give you a sense of where we stand as an institution with respect to the usage of social media platforms. On Facebook, we have a followership of 388,000. On X, 244,000. Instagram, 10,000. LinkedIn, very low at just under 3,000. And our total subscriber base on YouTube is 3,877. Now, social media provides an avenue for information sharing and public education, no doubt about that. But social media also holds the possibility for negative use, which could harm the integrity of the electoral process. To that extent, there are many social media management tools that we employ in order to mitigate the effects of digital harms. The first is social media monitoring. Sorry, I'm missing a word. There should be social media monitoring, which is really reactive in the sense that it looks at specific brand mentions and sends alerts whenever your brand is mentioned online. So each time the brand IEC is mentioned, we receive an alert that says your brand has been mentioned in this regard. Then it gives you an opportunity to evaluate whether that brand mention necessitates a reaction or not. Or it's something positive. It may even 90% of the times be a very positive mention, and so on. And then we also use social media listening, which is a proactive way to track, analyze, and respond to online conversations. Social media listening gives us a complete overview of all online conversations related to our brand. It's quite proactive. And it's a holistic approach because it provides us with valuable insight that help us to make strategic decisions on our marketing strategy, as well as on our overall social media strategy. Just to draw the distinction between the two, social media monitoring looks back, focuses on details, gathers information, and measures brand success. Whereas listening looks forward, looks at the bigger picture, analyzes information, and provides data to enable us to inform our strategy. Now, with respect to combating disinformation and misinformation, of course, there's daily monitoring of the platforms in the manner that I've just described. And there's an IC central email for reports of disinformation and misinformation. We intervene with immediate responses to correct disinformation that comes our way. But we also find that one of the instruments that are important to fight disinformation and misinformation is educating social media users on electoral processes, because an educated social media user is unlikely to be deceived by misinformation and disinformation. Not always, not every time 100%, but you stand a better chance of a person perceiving disinformation and misinformation if they've been placed in possession of correct information. So the education of social media users about the correct information, about electoral information and processes, it's a key component of the disinformation campaign. Partnerships with social media platforms to report disinformation and misinformation. I'll talk a bit about that. And platforms have internal processes to de-rank content that is reported to be disinformation and misinformation. They can even do takedowns, blacklisting, and in the most egregious of circumstances, they can even suspend accounts. But an important partnership that we have is the Real 411. And it's a partnership we have with Media Monitoring Africa. Real 411 is basically a web-based tool. It's also available as an app where instances of disinformation and misinformation can be reported related to elections for our purposes, related to elections. So once a complaint is received, it is subjected to an evaluation by a three-member committee who will evaluate whether, in fact, this constitutes mis or disinformation, or whether it's just robust electioneering or whatever the case is. And in the event the three-member committee found that to be a case of disinformation or misinformation, they then recommend to the IC to ask the platforms to do a de-rank, a takedown, a blacklisting, or even the suspending of an account. The idea, we strive to deal with such complaints on Real 411 within a 45 minutes time frame. Because I think someone did remark earlier here, anything that goes beyond 5 minutes on social media, it's already too late. So we want to improve our reaction time to complaints received so that we minimize the deleterious impact of misinformation and disinformation. Also facilitate dialogue with PLCs to ensure that parties and candidates take accountability for the content that is attributed to either themselves or their members, and so on. So there's been a lot of educational interfaces between the platforms themselves, MMA, ourselves, and political role players, so that they are conscientized about the correct usage of social media, and thereby contribute to less disinformation and misinformation. May I add that I've neglected to put here on the slides the issue about a repository of adverts of political parties as they pertain to the election. There is what we call PADRE. Again, it's a partnership between ourselves and MMA, where we're asking political parties to deposit all their advertising collateral that they use on social media. Because that helps if there's a complaint, if there's a generative AI thing that purports to be from one party or the other, we can quickly check against their official collateral. And that helps us and MMA, as well as the 3-member professional team that evaluates whether this, in fact, it's not something that is from a party. If we have official party marketing collateral on social media. Now, in order for us to create a cooperation with social media platforms, we signed in July a framework of cooperation so that everyone can be clear about what the expectations are vis-a-vis the complaints that we get via Real 411. And that a framework of cooperation was signed with Google, Meta, TikTok, and MMA. And as I say, it's really an endeavor to create conditions which are conducive for free and fair election by eliminating from the process instances of disinformation and mis and disinformation. Of course, the framework is not a necessarily legally binding, but it establishes cooperation in good faith. And the framework aligns with the Constitution, the Electoral Act, I think. It is not intended to negate the free flow of information. It is not intended to negate the freedom of expression that people have in terms of the Constitution. But it's a framework that actually gives practical effect to the constitutional rights, to the rights and obligations that people have in terms of the Electoral Act, as well as the Electoral Code of Conduct. Now, online platforms may implement their own internal policies and processes, such as content removal, advisory warning, and delisting to address disinformation that has been identified through Real 411. There is a working group established in terms of that cooperation framework to promote access to accurate information. In other words, giving people content that is correct. Because as I indicated at the beginning, you stand a better chance of addressing disinformation and misinformation in a context where correct information is freely available in the public domain. Now, if we move beyond Real 411 and the framework agreement that we have with social media platforms, we also did work or rather we're doing work on the African continent, because I think it's important that we have a realization that South Africa cannot be an island of success on its own. We've got to work with the continent to ensure that social media is used in a manner that enhances the credibility of electoral processes on the continent, rather than used in a manner that negates the credibility of elections on the continent. So I say, working with the AU and the UNDP, we developed guidelines and principles that govern the use of digital and social media in elections. And this is very timely because there are going to be no less than 20 elections on the African continent in this calendar year. South Africa being a major focus, Botswana, Namibia, and so on. So there are huge elections on the continent affecting no less than 20 countries. And the purpose of these guidelines, which, by the way, are available on our website, the intention really is to contribute to the integrity of electoral processes by promoting access to electoral information and addressing harms to digital human rights as a result of content that may be harmful. So the guidelines will serve as a resource for digital and social media campaigns, digital messaging platforms, for the internal policy processes of electoral management bodies. It will hopefully also inform regulatory processes which are under development and so on. But again, the guidelines and the principles are a human rights-based, in their orientation, they are human rights-based. Their orientation is not to minimize or degrade, as it were, the human rights of African people, but is to give effect to existing human rights instruments that are available, especially the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. So the guidelines and principles are predicated on the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, not a negation thereof. So the guidelines deals with the regulation, deals with monitoring, and deals with the enhancement of the normative framework, but they emphasize digital literacy. Again, I can't overemphasize this point that digital literacy is an important weapon in the fight against disinformation and misinformation. There are challenges. there are challenges, really, and opportunities, because it would not be an honest assessment if we say the initiatives that we have will ameliorate all challenges 100%. It is not so, because social media, it's a fast-moving organism. And when you deal with one element, something new emerges and so on. But we do acknowledge that it is social media is cost-effective, it's instantaneous, and it has a measurable reach. But it does come with greater disinformation potential and huge reputational risk. So on our side, we've added extra capacity and expertise to produce engaging content and manage social media channels effectively during the election. So those monitoring tools that I spoke about, we are already using them. And our stakeholder engagement processes with business, social, civil society, government have been enhanced so that we share with all stakeholders what our strategy is and so on. And we are, as a result, we are geared for improved responsiveness, especially against things such as allegations of voter fraud and dumped ballots, because there's a tendency to replay and post things that happened in the past as though they are new occurrences and so on. So all those things we are alive to, and we've prepared accordingly to deal with instances such as those. That is our presentation this morning, and I thank you for your audience.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Mamabolo, for your insightful presentation. We were hoping that you will share the proposed date of the upcoming elections, unintentionally so. But yes, thank you so much. It's quite interesting to know that the youth constitute 50% of social media. That's now persons between the age of 18 to 34. We also note the measures that you are introducing, ranging from proactive way to track conversations, as well as educating social media users, the partnerships that you are forming, as well as the intervention with regards to the Real 411 web tool, as well as the dialogues with PLCs and the framework for cooperation with the social media platforms. It's quite interesting, and thank you so much for that insightful presentation once again. Without further delay, we are now going to Advocate Boikanyo, who is the executive for POPIA. He will be presenting the guidance note on the processing of personal information of a voter. And thank you so much, Advocate Boikanyo. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Advocate Weapon. And let me start off by acknowledging the chairperson of the Information Regulator, Advocate Lakula, the members that are on this platform, the CEO of the regulator, Mr. Musalanyana Musala, the colleagues on the executive team, our partners for today's session, and more importantly, everyone that is on this platform. I wish to start off with at the very outset highlighting our legislative mandate, which is derived from the Constitution and more specifically Section 14 of our Constitution. As the Information Regulator, we owe our genesis to the Act, the Protection of Personal Information Act, popularly known as POPIA, and more specifically Section 39. So that makes us a creature of statute, and we are a juristic person. Let me start off by highlighting the purpose of the Act of POPIA. It is to regulate the manner in which personal information is processed by responsible parties. Now, we may well ask, what are these responsible parties? And it then becomes important to have regard to the definition of a responsible party as contained in the Act in Section 1 of our Act, which states that it means a public or private body or any other person which alone or in conjunction with others determines the purpose of and means of processing of personal information. Now, it then becomes important to, within the context of this definition, to highlight what our court held in the case of My Vote Counts NPC versus the Minister of Justice and Correctional Services in another. Our court held that political parties do not fall within the definition of public or private bodies, but fall within the definition of any other person. So your independent candidates and your political parties will be covered under any other person. And for that reason, they will then fall within the definition of responsible parties. The other purpose of POPIA is to establish the 8 lawful conditions for the lawful processing of personal information. The chairperson of the regulator touched on that, and to also provide remedies to data subject. Now, as a basis for our discussion, it becomes important, we can go to the slide that defines personal information. It then becomes important to define what is personal information. It is information that relates to an identifiable, living, natural person, and where it is applicable, an identifiable existing juristic person, including but not limited to the information related to the race of the person, the gender, sex, pregnancy, marital status, national, ethnic, social origin, age, physical or mental health, well-being, disability, religion, belief, culture, and the language of a person. It also information related to the education or the medical, financial, criminal, or employment history of the person, any identifying number, symbol, email address, physical address, telephone number, location information, online identifier, or other particular assignment to the person, the biometric information of the person, the personal opinions, views, or preferences of the person, correspondence sent by the person that is implicitly or explicitly of a private or confidential nature, or correspondence that would reveal the contents of the original correspondence, the views or the opinions of another individual about the person, and the name of the person if it appears with other personal information relating to the person, or if the disclosure of the name itself would reveal the information about the person. It then becomes important to look at the nature of the personal information that is processed by political parties. Political parties would process the name and the surname of the data subject, which are the voters, their cell number, email addresses, their physical addresses, donor information, voter information, the candidate list, political affiliation, and the political persuasion of a particular voter. It is essential to then, at this stage, highlight the fact that in processing this personal information, the political parties have to do so in accordance with the 8 conditions for the lawful processing of personal information. The chairperson of the regulator mentioned the 8 conditions for the lawful processing of personal information. And what are these conditions? The first condition is that of accountability. The second one is the processing limitation. The third one, purpose specification. The fourth one, further processing limitation. The fifth one, information quality. The sixth one, openness. Seventh one, security safeguards. And the last one, data subject participation. It then becomes necessary to zoom in and explain in a nutshell what these conditions are. The first one of accountability means that political parties must take overall responsibility to ensure that they process personal information lawfully. Regulation 4 prescribes that internal awareness sessions such as training be held regarding the POPIA, and a personal information impact assessment should be done by the political parties. A personal information assessment is done by organization of how personal information is handled to ensure adequate measures exist in order to comply with POPIA and by extension, the 8 conditions for the lawful processing of personal information. Accountability therefore means that the political parties must be able to demonstrate compliance with POPIA. The second condition relates to process limitation. It means that a political party may only process personal information that is reasonably needed upon obtaining consent directly from a voter or by making use of other justifications as provided for in Section 11 of POPIA. Political parties may not obtain personal information from data brokers or through applications that generate personal information such as telephone numbers and email addresses automatically. A voter should at any stage be able to object to the processing of their personal information. If a voter objects to the use of their personal information, a political party may no longer process that voter's personal information. The third condition is that of purpose specification. It means that political parties can only process personal information of voters for purposes directly related to the political party's activities. There are instances when political parties retain records of data subjects. They must, in doing so, they must ensure that they have adequate facilities that are secure where they can store these the personal information. Now the question is, where are these physical records kept? Are they in a secure environment where there will not be any security compromise of the personal information that is stored? An example, for instance, of such registers would be there are instances where political parties would do the door-to-door campaign, their door-to-door campaigns, and in the process, they would then have a register of those houses that they would have visited that contain personal information. So political parties have to ensure that the information in question is purpose specific. Further processing limitation under condition number 4 means that any further processing of personal information of voters must be compatible with the purpose for which the information was originally obtained. Example, information collected for purposes of donation or food parcel or for goodwill relief projects cannot be used for political campaigning. Condition number 5 is the information quality. Political parties must take practical, reasonable steps to ensure that personal information that they process is correct, up to date, and complete. And this dovetails quite nicely with the presentation by Mr. Mamabolo just before my presentation. Voters have the right to update their personal information. The next condition relates to openness. A voter must be notified that his or her personal information is being processed by a political party, and he or she must be aware of where the personal information was collected from, by the responsible party has a responsibility, and who the responsible party is that has collected such information. The 7th condition relates to security safeguard. Political parties must always ensure that they have put in place adequate security measures and controls to safeguard the confidentiality and the integrity of personal information of voters. A political party must notify the Information Regulator an affected voter or voters of the security compromise in the event that there is a security compromise. And this is in accordance with POPIA, specifically Section 22 of POPIA. The eighth condition is that of data subject participation. Political parties must, upon request by a voter, confirm whether they are processing the personal information of that voter, and they must allow for the process of correction and deletion of the personal information by the voter upon a request of the voter. Now, the next question that we're going to deal with in this presentation that I'm dealing with is, are there any exceptions applicable to political parties? In this regard, we need to have regard to Section 26 of POPIA that prohibits the processing of special personal information, which includes the persuasion of voters. However, political parties may process the political persuasion of voters in accordance with Section 31 of POPIA. What is this political persuasion? The political persuasion of a voter relates to the fact that a voter supports a particular political party. In terms of Section 31, a political party may process the personal persuasion of a voter for purposes of forming a political party, participating in its activities, engaging in the recruitment of members, canvassing support or voters for an election or a referendum, and campaigning for a political cause. It is important to highlight that Section 31 is an exception to the prohibition on the processing of special personal information and empowers political parties to process a voter's political persuasion. A political party must, however, still comply with the 8 conditions for the lawful processing of personal information. What does this mean for political parties? It means that a political party may not bombard voters with messages without first obtaining the voter's consent to process his or her personal information, such as a telephone number or an email address. The next question to be answered is whether a political party can send a voter direct marketing messages through unsolicited electronic communication. In this regard, it is important to have regard to what the definition in POPIA of direct marketing. POPIA defines direct marketing to include the offering of goods or services to a data subject in the ordinary course of business, or requesting a data subject to make a donation of any kind. Campaigning and or canvassing of vote by a political party does not fall within the ambit of this definition, offering goods and services in the ordinary course of business. However, in the campaigning for votes by these political parties, must be done with the consent of the voter. And in the canvassing, in respect of electronic communication, consent is very critical. Any approach by a political party requesting a donation from a voter through unsolicited electronic communication would fall within the definition of direct marketing and is prohibited unless the voter has consented to such marketing. It just highlights the issue of consent that I've just been speaking about. Political parties may ask a voter only once to obtain his or her consent for soliciting donations through electronic communication. Should the consent be withheld, the political party may not further contact such a voter. Political parties may not obtain personal information for direct marketing from data brokers or through applications that generate personal information, that is telephone numbers, automatically. We have had a very extensive presentation by Mr. Mamabolo on misinformation and disinformation. And within the context of POPIA, to the extent that the peddling of misinformation and disinformation would contain personal information such as names, gender, race, and personal opinions, views or preferences of persons as covered under the definition of personal information, then POPIA will apply. Political parties must avoid the practices of misinformation and disinformation when dealing with the voter personal information in order to be compliant with the 8 conditions of processing. This is specifically so because the responsible party must process personal information that is complete, accurate, updated, and not misleading in terms of condition 5. I've dealt with the 8 conditions, and this was what was highlighted under condition 5. The use of personal information contrary to POPIA. As a regulator, we have noted that political parties often obtain and use personal information in a manner that is contrary to the provisions of POPIA. The following examples are examples of processing of personal information in the manner that I've described. The purchasing of marketing lists and lifestyle information from data brokers without sufficient due diligence around those brokers, and the degree to which the data has been properly gathered and consented to. Also, the use of third-party data analytics companies with insufficient checks that those companies have obtained consent for the use of such personal information. The provision of contact lists of voters to social media companies without having done the necessary checks and verification. That is, was the data subject informed of such further processing of his or her personal information? What are the concerns that we have as a regulator relating to the processing of personal information? The lack of transparency resulting in voters being unable to exercise their rights in respect of personal information. The rights to object, the right to withdraw, the right to correct, and the right to delete personal information, etc. The creation of a system of voter surveillance. High-risk processing, that is processing of special information, special personal information process, that is political beliefs, race, gender, ethnicity. And of course, trans-border flow of information where we have voters in other jurisdictions. And the unlawful sharing of personal information. What are the measures that can be implemented by the political parties to ensure that they comply with POPIA? The political parties must make sure that they obtain consent or make use of other justifications that in terms of Section 11. Those justifications can be found in Section 11, 1A, 1B to F. The consent has already is mentioned under Section 11A. They should also allow for the correction and deletion of personal information by voters in accordance with Sections 23 and 24 of POPIA. They have to have adequate safeguards to ensure the integrity and the confidentiality of information that is under their control. This is what is outlined in Section 19 of POPIA. And as I've already mentioned before, they need to report any security compromise relating to personal information to the Information Regulator immediately. They have to conduct a personal information impact assessment in terms of Regulation 4. They should not retain records for longer than is necessary. This I've covered under under Condition 3. They should not process personal information for a purpose other than the one which is compatible with the original purpose for which the information was gathered. And this is in terms of Condition 3, as I've outlined when I dealt with the 8 conditions for the lawful processing. What are the offenses, penalties, and administrative fines that are applicable? And these are these are found in POPIA. Any person that contravenes Sections 100 to 106 of POPIA commits an offense, and Section 100 relates to obstruction of the regulator. Section 101, the breach of confidentiality. Section 102, the obstruction of execution of a warrant. Section 103, failure to comply with enforcement notices. Section 104, failure to appear when you are summoned by the regulator. And Section 105, unlawful acts by responsible parties in connection with account numbers. Section 106, unlawful acts by the third parties in connection with account numbers. What I need to highlight is that a contravention of POPIA may attract a fine of up to 10 million or imprisonment for a period not exceeding 10 years. The regulator may cause to be delivered an infringement notice if the responsible party does not comply with an enforcement notice that is issued by the regulator. The chair of the regulator, Advocate Lokula, has mentioned the fact that we have issued a guidance note in January 2019 because we recognize that there was guidance needed insofar as the processing of personal information is concerned. This guidance note can be accessed on our website, and the website is www.inforegulator.org.za. I need to just rehash what the chairperson said to say that the guidance note, as you would see, was issued in 2019, and there is therefore a need to update the guidance note to be in sync with the developments within the processing of personal information. And this is our priority at this current moment. The regulator is available to provide training sessions through Mr. Dimba's division, the EDUCOM division, and through webinars such as this one. And we encourage all political parties and all the members of the public to make use of these services. Thank you, Program Director.
Thank you so much, Advocate Boikanyo, for explaining the guidance note on the processing of personal information of a voter. And correctly so, the chairperson of the Information Regulator has referred to the fact that there will be concerns, and there are concerns around the number of messages that will be received during the heightened part or stage of the campaign season. And that for us is a concern. And we also then noted that you have brought in the issue so eloquently of the fact that consent is required before messages are sent. And that in itself is one of the ways in which we try to ensure that processing happens within the compliance of POPIA. And very importantly so, we also note the fact that the purchasing of marketing lists is a concern. And we also have a number of learnings, specifically the Cambridge Data Analytica, which is a lesson that we have taken note of with regards to the abuse of voters' personal information during elections, which is quite a useful lesson insofar as it is concerned with voters' personal information and the use of technology and the subsequent abuse of the voters' personal information. That being said, thank you once again, Advocate Boikanyo, for your presentation. We are now going to go over to the presentation of Ms. Nomshato Lubisi Nkosikulu, and the presentation relates to the role of political parties, civil society, social media companies in ensuring the integrity of the electoral process and the protection of personal information. Thank you so much, and over to you, Ms. Lubisi Nkosikulu.
Apologies, I'm just trying to share my PowerPoint presentation. If I can get confirmation if everyone can see.
Yes, your presentation is visible. Thank you so much.
Perfect.
You may continue.
Thank you so much. So just a brief kind of overall summarization of what I'll be speaking about today. without being repetitive, obviously, in terms of highlighting the big issue here around mis and disinformation. So I'll be looking at the innovations and tools that we have created, our collaborations, and basically the overall context of how mis and disinformation is thriving within digital media, but also in terms of offline. A bit about Media Monitoring Africa for those that are not familiar with our organization. We started operating in 1993, and our original purpose for that was to start monitoring how media will cover our first democratic elections during 1994, particularly looking at the mere fact that our media was going into a transition of media freedom. And it was just us starting to analyze in terms of topics, in terms of voices, in terms of issues that were covered by media during that time. Media Monitoring Africa has monitored each and every electoral process in terms of elections, in terms of media coverage, and particularly since 2019 in terms of mis and disinformation since then. So our data is quite vast, and I think our experience behind certain issues are also quite vast because of that. We have quite a human rights based approach, looking at, number one, we want to ensure that we're promoting obviously a media that is transparent, diverse, ethical, particularly in terms of being accountable to the audience that it's speaking to. Most importantly, to have an informed and engaged citizenry, particularly as mentioned by the CEO, that it's quite important for us to ensure that our citizens, number one, are informed with credible information, but second to that, are equipped with enough to be able to make informed decisions. So one of the starters and assumptions that we've had, particularly looking at a global context, but also a local context, is starting to look at digital media in a different context, particularly within Africa. And I'll just zone it back in home in terms of South Africa. When we're starting to look at, number one, the usage of social media, number two, the interaction and access when it comes to information. But second to that, in terms of literacy, where are we? And particularly the gap that's also still there. And one of the key things that I think we can definitely all agree to is that in terms of the spreading of online harms, that's definitely unprecedented, rather. But one of the introductions to that as well is looking at political ad spend. And I think that's one of the introductions to Padre, which I'll touch on, that also actually plays quite a role when it comes to access to information, but also interacting with information online. And how does that look like, right? The problem that we have here, number one, I think we can all agree to this, is that mis and disinformation is actually one of the biggest threats when it comes to our democracy. Second to that is that because as South Africa and as Africa, we're still dealing with a huge issue of a digital divide, and the issue of digital literacy skills is still at the forefront, is one of the biggest issues that we are facing, but most importantly, trying to, in terms of the gap to close. Second to that is the realization in terms of trends of mis and disinformation is that most of the time when we're talking about it or when we're trying to address it and combat it, we're very much so on the online sphere of it. But in actual sense, how it trickles down to offline is one of the key elements as well that we want to highlight. But also how it's such an intersectional threat when we're talking about other online harms, such as hate speech, such as harassment, such as online violence and offline violence as well, but also looking at how it plays a role in each element of digital offenses. Now, I want to just spend a bit more time on this because I think one of the key things in understanding what we're dealing with is, number one, understanding what it is, but also understanding how to define it. Over the years, we've been talking about fake news. And as Media Monitoring Africa, it's one of the terms that, I mean, it's used by those in power to try to deflect accountability in terms of what they're being held to account for by media. But the issue that we're really dealing with here is actually disinformation, right? Which is deliberate content that is created to cause harm. Where mis and disinformation kind of splits is the mere fact that somebody creates this content and it thrives through misinformation, meaning the sharing of the information without the intention of causing harm is where the impact of disinformation is thriving. And it's also where we're starting to see the gap, that the mere fact that the likes, the shares, and the comments and the engagement is what causes it to stay alive online, clearly shows that the audience that we're supposed to be speaking to and equipping and actually helping to understand what we're dealing with here are the users themselves, offline and online, right? But also what we're starting to kind of see over the years as well is the use of malinformation when it comes to harassment and when it also comes to hate speech. And we've started to see a lot of our female journalists, particularly in this element, being targeted, particularly around elections as well, when it comes to ensuring that information is being shared to audiences, but most importantly, that power is also being held to account, because this is where we start to see more of a contextualized type of reporting, right? Rather than an event-based. And that's what we're trying to promote at the same time. And that's where the access to information as well comes to when we're talking to political parties in terms of helping audiences and citizens understand in a full holistic way, what exactly are you standing for? And I will not touch on that mostly here, but it's for me to just highlight when we're talking about the issue, we need to start understanding the different definitions and how they actually marry each other. But we also need to start highlighting that disinformation is actually an intersectional threat that is very, very, very evident when it comes to looking at the different digital offenses as well. So we're looking at all threats, new powers, and mechanisms here, and I think it's been mentioned by a previous speaker as well, there's a lack of strong digital media literacy skills when we're talking about in terms of a local context. And this is where we start seeing that people still don't understand that there's such a thing called disinformation that exists. Most importantly, how it's amplified by the usage of AI. So we're not even being advanced when we start talking about deepfakes, when we start talking about the mere fact that I can take somebody's voice, somebody's face, and somebody's audio and let it say completely something different and post that online. And the mere fact that that content has become so sophisticated that even for fact checkers, it's quite difficult to differentiate, right? It clearly says that we've got quite a gap that we need to start working towards. And as much as we can say that media obviously plays a very crucial role when it comes to information dissemination during this period, but the public also as well needs to ensure that they've upskilled and they've got the skills to be able to interact with all the information that they will be flooded by. And I think we can all agree to this when we're saying that our current political climate, and particularly when we're looking at the recent changes in terms of our electoral act, it does pose a set of challenges, because it means that, number one, the media themselves obviously need to be able to portray the information. But second to that, the audience and the citizens themselves need to be able to understand the changes as well. And I think one of the initiatives that we did in collaboration with the IC and CENIF last year when it came to doing the media workshops provincially helped us to actually understand what are the different understandings and issues within each province, but also to start equipping media directly. And this is media in terms of commercial and also media in terms of community media, because in most instances when we talk about them, we separate them as entities, but they're actually quite one, right? Whereas community media is starting to speak on the ground and really bringing in that audience voice. And obviously commercial media plays quite a large role in that as well. All right, this is one of the quotes that I like sharing, and I'm not really going to delve into it. But the one particular part here, it looks at knowledge from a different perspective, particularly where we are dealing with issues of information disorders, of information manipulation, of basically information creation from any perspective that one could create. And I think it really speaks to how important it is that when we start talking about information, we really speak of it from a landscape of what can mis and disinformation do to this information, but most importantly, are the citizens themselves equipped with the credible information that they're supposed to be interacting with. So part of our solutions that we've basically come together on in terms of media monitoring Africa, it comes in four folds. One is the understanding that we can no longer work in silos. We can no longer create initiatives and solutions by just working in a little corner by ourselves in terms of organizations, whether it's civil society, whether it's media, whether it's government, whether it's the different entities. And it really stresses the importance of a multi-stakeholder approach, because in that way, we're able to actually amplify the work that we're all doing. But most importantly, we're actually able to bring all our resources together. I think one of the initiatives on this part that was mentioned by the CEO was the framework of cooperation, which is being able to bring all the social media platforms to the table and be able to actually emphasize that mis and disinformation actually is a great threat for our country when it comes to elections. And number one, the most important thing is the speed in which that we deal with it, but also the speed in which the platforms themselves assist us in this process. X being one of the platforms that is not part of that framework of cooperation, but in previous years there were. But in terms of obviously the different changes that the platform actually went through, but it also poses the dire need of them actually coming to the table as well. But this is a large, big step that not only South Africa, but Africa has taken to be able to do something like this. It's a first step of many. There's still many issues that we still need to address in terms of transparency, in terms of accountability. But the mere fact that we're able to do this clearly shows that there's possibility of us being able to create that engagement with the platforms. Second to that is looking at how do we bring key civil society bodies together. And this is where we've got the Mis and Disinformation elections working group. And this is bringing in organizations such as Africa Check, such as CENEF, such as AIP, etc., who are very key in our society when it comes to implementations, when it comes to advocacy, when it comes to ensuring that democracy is held at the highest end. And this is us all coming to the table and saying, how can we all work together and ensure that we are enhancing each of our initiatives? And I mean, the greatest part about here is that Real 4-in-1, for example, the mechanism that was built, we can easily start incorporating DFR Lab, for example, when it comes to behavioral analysis around mis and disinformation. When it comes to fact checking, we've got Africa Check as well. So clearly, when we're bringing in all those bodies to actually start mitigating this issue, it starts to speak to the importance of collaboration and the importance of not working in silos. Second to that is looking at local innovation. Tools such as, Real 4-in-1, such as Padre, are actually quite key in ensuring that we're bringing in that element of localization, but we're also using technology to assist us in actually dealing with the issue. Third to that is monitoring analysis and obviously producing data from that. And this is something that Media Monitoring Africa has been doing since 1993. I'll speak to this briefly in my next slide. I think the last one is very important when it comes to campaigning and understanding that whatever initiative that we have in terms of literacy when it comes to the public is very important, whether it's around the electoral process, whether it's around mis and disinformation, or whether it's generally about how to interact with information online. Not taking everything at face value is very important in the start of basis of understanding that when it comes to the election period or any sort of period where it really deals with anxiety, deals with a flood of information, it deals with uncertainty, we need to ensure that the citizens at the foremost are equipped with all the necessary skills and information that they need. I'm not going to go through this briefly, but this is just a summary of basically all our initiatives in four folds at Media Monitoring Africa that we'll be doing throughout the election periods and after. The workshops, the platforms, the ad observatory, which I'll speak to as well, the trainings as well, and obviously the monitoring that we're doing, and really equipping journalists to the fullest when it comes to ensuring that we are actually dealing with the issue of fact-checking within newsrooms, but also the understanding that mis and disinformation can't easily also be spread through media itself. They need to understand how to deal with information when it comes to fact-checking it before actually even publishing it. So this is just kind of like a summary of, as I said, our initiatives during this period. So this is Dexter. Dexter currently right now has over 3.3 million curated news stories. It's the platform that we use when it comes to monitoring news coverage. And the exciting part about this is that media themselves and public citizens will have access to the live dashboard. And what will this do basically is kind of assist in understanding which voice is being heard the most, for example, which political party is getting more air, in terms of gender, is it female or male that's currently, dominating the space in terms of voice. So this is very key and important because it also comes back to ensuring that we have balanced reporting, transparent reporting, contextual reporting, and most importantly, fair reporting as well during the election period. These are just some of the breakdown of stats that we've gotten from Dexter. This is the previous local elections that we had, and clearly it indicates in terms of voices, we've still got quite a way to go in terms of ensuring that we have balanced voices being heard. And also, this is just part of an example in terms of what kind of data that we get from Dexter as well. My key focus, as mentioned, is Real4 One, which was piloted in 2019 together with the IEC. And particularly in 2018, Media Monitoring Africa was starting to see two key issues. Was number one, that we're dealing with a huge issue of a rise when it comes to mis and disinformation. Particularly, there's not a mechanism that empowers citizens to actually be able to do something. The issues that we started seeing when it comes to reporting on social media platforms in terms of timeframes of response, in terms of mitigating the issue in a period where we are ensuring that whatever it caused, it can be really cocooned to a point where we're not dealing with a larger scale of an issue. Third to that, the issue of language. The mere fact that mis and disinformation is not only created in English or is not only circulated in English, it can be created in any of our official languages was one of the issues that we also started seeing. And the mere fact of definition, what hate speech is defined in our country is not the same as in some other countries, right? And the mere fact that there are guidelines and standards, community standards as well, differs in terms of being able to adapt to our local constitution and local definitions. And this is where really Real4 One comes in. And it was piloted in 2019. For the 2024 elections, we are a partner with the IEC again. And really, this is a platform which we've seen be kind of like the key forefront of ensuring that citizens do feel like there's somewhere that they can go. And most importantly, it can be dealt with in a matter of hours, because the longer it runs through different platforms, the more we've got a burning issue to deal with, particularly in terms of takedown notices, whether that's the outcome or whether it's even just issuing the mere fact of an alert that there is current narratives, for example, that are circulating and they are deemed as mis and disinformation. And most importantly, it offers transparency. So meaning that anyone can actually interact with the different complaints that have been submitted online. However, the personal information of the individual that has submitted the complaint is not visible to the public. That is only for the Real4 One backend system to be able to send through the outcome of the complaint that was submitted. So the individual can know how obviously the complaint itself was reviewed, but second to that, what was the action that was taken at the end. And this really provides the understanding for anybody to be able to see currently what are the type of trends we're dealing with when it comes to narratives around mis and disinformation at that time, because it really assists in terms of people being able to interact with information differently online as well. This is how the dashboard currently looks like in terms of the elections. And as I said, the complaints are much more available there in terms of being able to interact with that. Second to that, there's also quite a lot of resources on the site as well in terms of understanding mis and disinformation and the other digital offenses as well. And we also do have a Real4 One app, which is integrated with an app that we created previously to start helping individuals be able to spot credible information to mis and disinformation. So it also has kind of like a fun element to start getting people to to, whether it's website content, social media content, or news content, to start interacting with that information differently from a lens of a fact-checking eye. At the back end, in terms of the complaints form, it looks like this, whereby, as I said, you can either submit a complaint on mis or disinformation, incitement to violence, hate speech, or harassment. Where did you see this? Whether it was WhatsApp, YouTube, Facebook, X, Instagram, etc. What language was it in? Whether it's Xitsonga, isiXhosa, isiZulu, Sesotho, Setswana, whichever of the South African languages, obviously they will be selected. And then once submitted, it goes through a review process, which is done by legal experts, tech experts, and media experts. These are just some of the examples that we started seeing along the lines of the different platforms as obviously the election period is coming through. The most important thing I want to highlight is in some instances, we'd assume that the most period whereby mis and disinformation would be thriving would be in the period of the actual elections. But pre-elections was also a platform for a lot of people to sow either division, confusion, anxiety amongst citizens. So in terms of when should we start dealing with this issue, when should we start combating and ensuring that we're equipping citizens, it's like yesterday that should have started happening. Padre, so this is the political party advert repository. This deals with the issue of no longer are we in the era whereby political parties just used to do traditional, campaigning, whether it's posters on the robot, on the walls, etc. Now we have actual media assets that are created by political parties themselves. But these assets doesn't stop anybody from actually taking those assets, manipulating them to actually say something completely different. And this repository basically also gives power to the political parties themselves to start playing their role when it comes to ensuring that we are all working together to ensure that everyone is actually interacting with credible information. What this allows the political parties to do is to actually submit all their media assets in terms of campaigning, whether it's a video, whether it's a graphic that they created for the different social media platforms. This can be accessed by anybody, and they can actually verify whether what they're interacting with on social media is actually created by the political party themselves or actually was manipulated. This is just a brief screenshot from previous elections, just to give an idea of how the backend would look like. There is a search function, so whether you're searching in terms of per party or whether you're searching per term, or where obviously you saw the ad being done. The nice thing about this as well, it consolidates all the assets that are created by the political parties themselves. So it actually also gives leeway for citizens to start interacting with the different messaging from the different parties in one platform, outside from obviously ensuring that they are able to compare that what they are interacting with is actually created by the political party themselves. Second to that is the social media ad campaigns, which is a new feature that was added to Padre this year, particularly because political adverts on social media platforms is quite key in terms of transparency and highlighting this to citizens, because some people still don't understand how algorithms work, how social media ads work. Why is it that I'm being exposed to this content every single time I'm scrolling through my feed? So this helps citizens to actually start interacting with the mere fact that political party A is running an ad on Facebook for so much spend and for such a period of time, and it was published on this date, to give transparency to the mere fact that there's this ad that's going on, and this is why you're basically being exposed to such content all the time. I think this also is coming from a global context of the power that lies behind social media ads, and most importantly, to the transparency that is needed in terms of this information. This is just some of the resources. Obviously, there's much more when it comes to all the different basically organizations that have live dashboards during the time period, and also we'll be running quite a lot of data around this. I think, yeah, that's me trying to stick to my 15 minutes. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Ms. Rubisi Nkosi Nkulu, for your interesting take. It is quite useful information that you've provided even to myself with regards to the local innovations that you have introduced. The chairperson of the Information Regulator has referred to an example of how an identity of someone can be assumed, or assuming of an identity of someone else. And that is also one of the issues that you've touched on. And that could also then be one of the issues that we see the CEO of the IEC has referred to as being part of the issues that can impact the credibility of the elections. And it is quite useful to note that the multi-party or the multi-stakeholder approach has been coming through from the different presentations, which is quite useful. Interesting to note that you also referred to the fact that the response time to mis and disinformation is important. And the CEO of the IEC referred to a 45-minute response time to actually avoid irreparable harm. And we also note how the innovation around PADRI also promotes transparency, which is very important because the chairperson of the Information Regulator also referred to our dual mandate in balancing personal information and the promotion of access to information. We have now come to the end of the presentations of speakers, and we are now going to hand over to Mr. Dimba for the question and answer session. Mr. Dimba, over to you.
Thank you so much, Advocate Weapon, and thank you to our speakers for such a feast of information and insights on these topics. And I'm quite sure that the rest of the participants enjoyed the presentations as much as I did. We're going to request Ms. Maristella Simiyu from the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria to offer a response to what she's heard from the speakers, and that will then lead us to the question and answer session, where we'll take specific questions from the participants, and I'll put those to each of the speakers. Without further ado, Maristella, over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much for that. As you heard, my name is Maristella Simiyu. I work with the Center for Human Rights, which is based at the University of Pretoria. And maybe before I just give my 2 cents about what the other speakers have talked about, let me just also give a brief about the Center for Human Rights for those who do not know about the center. It's an academic institution as well as an NGO, so it does serve a dual function. On the academic side, we have master's programs, 5 of them. We have a PhD program, as well as advanced human rights short courses on different themes that are held at different times throughout the year. And actually, in September 24th this year, we will be launching a data protection in Africa short course, which will be a first that we have never done before. And for anybody who is interested, you can actually join us, look at our website, or reach out to me, and I'll give you more information about that. So for our topic today on misinformation and disinformation and data protection during the election period, first, I want to thank the Information Regulator for organizing this convening, which is very important. We do know the increasing role that is played by data in driving political campaigns, and we've had this in the presentations that our esteemed panelists have given. We know how this does impact misinformation and disinformation campaigns and how they do influence voter behavior. So seeing what the Information Regulator is doing, seeing what the IEC is doing, as well as Media Monitoring Africa, it is encouraging to see that different stakeholders are taking initiatives and are coming up with interventions to address this concern, because there are implications on privacy, there are implications to data protection in this regard. And I know you said for me to make points on what our presenters have talked about, and really we have been having partnerships with the different with the different bodies that make up our panelists. We have had partnerships with the IEC in this regard. We've had partnerships with MMA in this regard in terms of how do we find rights-based approaches to misinformation and disinformation in the election period. One project that the Center for Human Rights is working on is on access to information during elections, and basically looking at what is the state of information integrity during elections? How can we as electoral stakeholders come together and come up with rights-based approaches to addressing this scourge? The chairperson talked about this mounting challenge of misinformation and disinformation that we can see we are trying to address through different interventions. So for the Center for Human Rights, we do have a project that focuses on compliance with the guidelines on access to information and elections in Africa. This has been touched on by MMA, just to see how electoral stakeholders can ensure proactive disclosure of information. Why we look at the issue of access to information is because it is a way to get ahead issues of misinformation and disinformation. When the electorate has access to credible information, accurate information on a timely basis, it will be a way to seal off any loopholes that will allow the flourishing of misinformation and disinformation. And so when I hear MMA talk about PADRI, when I hear MMA talk about the Real 1-1, as well as the interventions by the IEC and the Information Regulator, we do see proactive means that electoral stakeholders have brought into place, that our commissions, our institutions have put in place to get ahead this challenge of misinformation and disinformation. So in 2019, the center did actually have a maiden study that looked at South Africa's compliance with the guidelines on access to information and how electoral stakeholders are ensuring proactive disclosure of information during elections. And since then, we have been undertaking an advocacy project to implement the recommendations of the 2019 report ahead of the 2024 elections. And in this regard, we've been working together with the Information Regulator, the IEC, the South African Human Rights Commission, Media Monitoring in Africa, as well as SANEF. We did have an engagement with political parties and candidates in this regard, and we are planning another one 13th February. And it was interesting listening to the Information Regulator talking about the guidance notes that they came up with for political parties and candidates, that I believe is an important resource that needs to be widely distributed to all political parties and candidates, just to ensure that when it comes to political campaigning, when it comes to the data that you handle, it has to be done in a way that is respective of the principles that ensures the respect for the right to privacy, as well as the right to data protection. Another project that the center has that is relevant to our discussion today is on LEXOTA, which is an acronym for Laws on Expression Online, Track and Analysis. And basically, this is a research and advocacy tool that explores how laws on disinformation impact freedom of expression in sub-Saharan Africa. One of the areas that we looked at in this research is the duties of internet intermediaries with regards to the disinformation laws. We see a lot of disinformation laws coming up. South Africa does. We did review South Africa in this regard. And we can't ignore the fact that, as our panelists have talked about, social media companies do play a role in enabling the spread of misinformation and disinformation on their platforms, and whatever interventions that they have will impact the quality of information that the electorate and the general public have access to in these platforms. But what we realized from our research is that there are laws coming up, yes, indeed, but on this particular aspect of accountability and transparency of internet intermediaries, including social media companies, it's still an issue that needs further research, that needs further advocacy on our end. And there is a need to hold social media companies more accountable when it comes to the quality of information that is on their platforms. And something that we have been trying to push for in advocacy is not only the need to have the legal frameworks in place, but also to ensure that whatever legal frameworks, whatever interventions that are put in place are rights-based, that we are actually promoting rights-based approaches to evolving interventions when it comes to misinformation and disinformation during elections. And this is something that we hope we will that we do intend to explore more when it comes to the data protection calls that I talked about that we'll be having in September. I was given, I think, 5 minutes to talk about what the other panelists talked about, as well as the work that we're doing at the center with regards to misinformation and disinformation. And so we do look forward to our continued collaboration with all the stakeholders on this call today, on this convening today, to ensure that the quality of information that is available on the information ecosystem ahead of the 2024 election actually meets the standards of accuracy, reliability, credibility, and such that the electorate does go into the 2024 election ensured and confident that the quality of the electoral process will be enhanced by the quality of information available. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Simiyu. What is very clear from your intervention and that of Ms. Lubisi Nkosikulu is that collaboration and working together is going to be central if we are to introduce effective responses to the problem of mis and disinformation. And so it's going to be a continuous conversation amongst the partners that are present here. One of the things I would like our panelists to offer when we come to the close of the session is to offer some ideas of how we can take this work forward, how we can concretize some of the ideas that have been shared here on this session. But before we do so, I do have some questions from participants to the webinar that I would like to put to some of our speakers, starting with the CEO of the Electoral Commission of South Africa, Mr. Mamabolo. There was a question, sir, regarding the issue of AI platforms. In your presentation, you indicated the project that you have initiated with social media companies. But the question is, are there plans to engage AI platforms or at least include them in the good faith collective agreements that you have initiated with social media companies? Mr. Mamabolo, over to you, sir.
Yes, our position is always to have the broadest possible collaboration framework that there can ever be. And to the extent that AI platforms are emerging and willing to collaborate with us, we are all too willing to collaborate, because that can only be of benefit to the fight against disinformation and misinformation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mamabolo. Does anyone else from the panel want to come in on this question around engaging with AI platforms and AI companies before I move to the next question? And I don't see any takers. Let's take the next question for Advocate Buikanyo. Advocate Buikanyo, you indicated in your presentation that political parties need to conduct training on POPIA and the conditions for lawful processing of personal information. Now, the question on the board is, how often must political parties conduct these internal training interventions? Advocate Buikanyo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dimba. POPIA is not prescriptive of how often training should be conducted. But as far as possible, responsible parties should endeavor to ensure that at least once in a year, the various provisions of POPIA, they take their staff members or any persons associated with them through POPIA, so that there's a common understanding with regard to POPIA. And just to highlight the fact that when we conduct our assessments in terms of Section 89, one of the issues that we look at is whether there had been training that is offered by the responsible party. And we find that most of the responsible parties do not adequately train their staff members on the provisions of POPIA. So in as much as it is not prescriptive, POPIA leaves this within the discretion of the responsible parties, but responsible parties must ensure that there's that awareness of POPIA, and there's proper training relating to POPIA. And that is why I highlighted the fact that even as far as possible, the information regulator is available to assist through your department, through your division, to provide the necessary assistance with regard to the training.
Thank you, Advocate Bukanyo. Of course, we always say that POPIA compliance should be part and parcel of any organization's risk management framework and as part of good governance practice. So whenever these risk management reviews are done, whether it's reviewing the risk registers or completing the combined assurance framework, it's important to include issues of POPIA compliance within those exercises. And training should be one of those actions that are implemented to mitigate the risks. Yeah, so I fully agree with you. It should be a regular exercise, even though it's not specifically prescribed in POPIA. Advocate Bukanyo, while you still have the floor, there was another question around recourse that is available to voters in circumstances where a breach has occurred. What are the recourses available to voters, Advocate Bukanyo? And the members as well can weigh in on this question, chairperson of the regulator and members of the regulator.
Where there's an instance of unlawful processing of personal information, POPIA allows a data subject, Mr. Dimba, to lodge a complaint with the information regulator. That complaint will then go through the process. It will be investigated. It may culminate in the complaint being before the enforcement committee, leading to an enforcement notice and eventually an infringement notice. But there are instances where we, as a regulator, may be asked to conduct an assessment on the responsible party in terms of Section 89. And when we pick up that there's a necessity for us to do that, we'll then conduct that assessment on the responsible party in terms of Section 89. We'll then produce a report. That report will then also serve as an enforcement notice. It will be issued by the members of the regulator. It will direct the responsible party on certain things that they need to take care of that they should address in terms of POPIA. Unless I will leave it at that, unless the members have additional things to add to that.
Let me open it up to the members if anyone would like to add.
No, nothing on my side, Mr. Dimba. Thank you. Thank
you, CEO. Another question we got was with regards to the Padre platform, Ms. Nomshato Lubisi Nkosinkulu. The question is, what has been the take up by political parties on the Padre platform? Are they cooperating with yourselves as the initiators of the platform? Are they submitting their ads? And what would you say to them? We have political party liaison committees on this call today. What would you say to them to encourage them to participate in the Padre platform? Ms. Lubisi Nkosinkulu, are you still on the line? It looks like we've lost it.
Yes, Mr. Dimba, I think we've lost her.
Perhaps Mr. Mamabolo could offer some thoughts on the Padre platform.
The uptake has not been great, but we still think it's an important intervention. So we keep going, we keep engaging with political parties to show them the benefit of placing their collateral with us in the Padre platform. In fact, we are also checking the legal viability of regulating that in a way to encourage them through regulatory possibility. We are not at the point where the matter is fully percolated, but considerations are underway in that regard.
Okay, no, thank you. There's a request for the web address of the Padre platform and the Real 411 platform. I think I will request Ms. Zondi to share those with the participants, either on the chat box or on email to those that had registered ahead of time. Let me just see if there are more questions on the platform. No, there aren't any yet. So maybe this is the right moment to just ask the speakers to offer final thoughts around how we take this work forward, because the point that was made by Ms. Lubisi Nkosinkulu as well as Ms. Simuyu was that we need collaboration. We need to stop working in silos in order to establish concrete and effective interventions in addressing the problem of mis and disinformation. So perhaps some thoughts and ideas of how we take this work forward. Let me recognize the chairperson of the regulator, Advocate Tlakula.
Thank you, Mr. Dimba. I think please check the chat box and also the Q&A. There are some questions there that needs some responses. I said during my intervention that there was a proposal from the Party Liaison Committee, which is a committee of political parties, that we should convene a multi-stakeholder workshop on this matter. And I think that's one of the concrete proposals I think that will be taking forward. I don't know who's going to take the lead. We may have to take the lead as the regulator. I don't know, CEO and Mr. Dimba, whether I'm committing you, but I'm mindful of the fact that the Electoral Commission is very busy with preparations for elections. So it will assist if we lend a hand. Thank you.
Absolutely, Chair. I think we are more than ready to take this forward, of course, in partnership with others, such as the Center for Human Rights. I know the Center will be convening a session, a stakeholder engagement session very soon on the access to information side of things. But I think we have something to work with here in order to convene this multi-stakeholder workshop on mis and disinformation. I think it's the necessary step to take forward. May I hand over to Mr. Mamabolo for some thoughts on how to take this work forward?
I just wanted to endorse the proposal on the table and confirm the willingness of the IEC to partner with stakeholders on the table to host that a multi-stakeholder thing with the lead, with the information regulator in the lead. But we would be available to participate as much as we need to. Thanks.
Thank you, CEO. Ms. Miyu, are you on board? Can we rely on your good offices, ma'am?
Definitely, we are on board. As we did say, we have a planned engagement with media and civil society already on the 13th of February. And the proposal that has been put forward by the chair as well as Mr. Mabolo, we are definitely on board because
I have lost your audio, Ms. Miyu.
Okay, I was saying that we are definitely on board, as we had indicated earlier, that we do have an engagement that is scheduled for 13th of February, where we'll also be working with the IEC, the Information Regulator, and other partners. And so it is something that's already in the works for us. So we are definitely on board for this multi-stakeholder convening.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Okay,
Fabulous. Thank you so much. There is a question as we draw this to a close. There is a question I wanted us to deal with because it's also an important question. I would like to invite. I don't know if Mr. Nemasisi is still on the platform. There was a question around the voters' right to information about political parties. Mr. Nemasisi, who is our executive responsible for promotion of access to information act, would you like to weigh in on this question? What are the voters' rights to information about political parties?
Thank you so much, Mr. Dimba, and good afternoon to the chairperson, members, and the CEO of the IEC and other stakeholders. Indeed, the right to access to information, it emanates from our constitution, and therefore we definitely people do have the right to access to the information, irrespective of what information. The Constitution provides that it's right to any information. So anyone who would want to access the information, especially from your political parties, from the IEC, which is very important. I've seen they do a lot of stakeholder engagement in terms of ensuring that the voters do access information. That is the right thing because that's what our Constitution provides. So if anyone refuses you access to information, you then have to come to the Information Regulator. We've got power to enforce that constitutional right of access to information, and we've got different ways to speed up the process to ensure that you do receive your information, which will enable you to exercise your right to vote. So definitely the information regulators are available to assist. Thank you, Mr. Dima.
Thank you, Mr. Nemasisi. We are now drawing towards the end of the session, and I would like to hand back to the Program Director, Advocate Colin Weapon. The announcement I have, Advocate Weapon, is that the CEO of the regulator has a difficulty to join. So the closing item will be done by Advocate Struom Nzama. Over to you, Advocate Weapon.
Thank you so much, Mr. Dimba, for your Q&A session. Yes, of course, I've noted that. Advocate Struom, I'm going to hand over to you to do the vote of thanks and to close the session. Thank you so much. Over to
Advocate
you.
Weapon, I'm sorry, Advocate Weapon. I think I've just spotted the CEO sitting in Ms. Letsuiti's office.
Oh, my
Maybe
apology.
the CEO can confirm if he was able to
100%.
join.
Yes, CEO, good afternoon. And can you please confirm?
Yes, I'm not sure whether I'm audible. Can you hear me?
You are CEO. Yes, we can. Thank you, CEO. Can I hand over to you?
May I proceed?
Yes, please. Thank you, CEO.
Thank you very much, Advocate Weapon. Good afternoon to all. Mine is it's a very, very simple task, that of closing the session. But before I do that, may I take this opportunity to thank everyone who has taken part in this session through presentation, questions, and so on. But a special word of thanks go to Advocate Weapon for ably program directing the session well. From the beginning, Mr. Dimba for introducing our guests and speakers, and for giving an introduction of why we have this session. I would also like to thank our chairperson, Advocate Takula, for setting the scene and for giving sort of direction on what the regulator needs to do, but also for coming up with proposals on what all other institutions can do. My thanks goes to Mr. Sam Mamabolo, the CEO of the IEC, for his presentation on what the IEC is intending to do during election and preparation towards election around this topic that was before us today of misinformation and disinformation. I think the issue of partnership has come out strong from what I've heard. of Education and Cooperation. Advocate Vicanyo presented our guidance note. In it, he presented the 8 conditions for lawful processing of personal information. And I would like to thank him for a good presentation and for outlining what our role is and what are the responsibilities of political parties. Ms. Lubisi Nkosinkulu also presented on Media Monitoring Africa's role, how it interacts with different stakeholders. We thank you very much, ma'am, for your presentation and for assisting us to understand your role during the build-up to the elections. We have a brief summary by Ms. Mary Stella Simiyu from the University of Pretoria on what will be the role of the university in also participating and being a partner in this journey we are taking towards the elections. I'd like to thank all the participants for attending this session, for their questions, for their views and inputs. And lastly, chairperson of the session, I'd like to thank the staff of the regulator for organizing this webinar and for enabling us to celebrate and commemorate this International Data Privacy Day through this webinar. Keep on doing the good work, colleagues from EDUCOM. Thank you very much, Chairperson, and we bring this webinar to closure. I thank you.